On the Mishnah on Daf Vav Amid Aleph. Very lengthy Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Chavite Kohen Gadol. Regarding the Chavite Kohen Gadol, which is the mincha that the Kohen Gadol brought daily, Lishasan, Varichasan, Vafiyasan, Bifnim. Every part of the process of the Chavite Kohen Gadol, I need to plug in, every part of the process of the Chavite Kohen Gadol has to be done inside the Azara. Why is that? So Rashi explains, although, according to Rabbi Akiva, the dry kalim that are used to measure dry, like flour, was not nimshach with the shemen hamishcha, so it could be done outside. The Chavite Kohen Gadol's kalim were. And the reason is very simple. The average measuring cup that they would use, the isaron that they would use for the standard mincha, was used by everybody. I don't trust most people. You'd rather not give most people a klisharis, because if they accidentally take it out, you'd rather it be safe and use a klichol. Chavite Kohen Gadol was handled by the Kohen Gadol himself, so therefore we're not as concerned. So the Gemara says, "Look, you'll turn on after you're done." Yeah. It was nimshach with the shemen hamishcha. Therefore, every process of the Chavite Kohen Gadol had to be done inside the azar. Now, Mishnah says, V'doiches is Shabbos, and the Chavite Kohen Gadol's process, because it had to be done daily, and because it had to be in a klisharis, it had to be done that day. You can't do it the day before because it'll be nifsa balina. Therefore, it's doiches Shabbos. But chinasan v'arktasan ain't doiches Shabbos. But the grinding and sifting of the flour was not doiches Shabbos. Why? Because that could be done on erev Shabbos. And the Mishnah tells us the rule. Klal amar Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva tells the rule. Kol malecha she'ef shel asoysim erev Shabbos im doiches Shabbos. V'sheyeh shel asoysim erev Shabbos doiches Shabbos. Something that must be done on Shabbos is doiches Shabbos. Something that can be done erev Shabbos is not doiches Shabbos. Therefore, the grinding of the flour, which can be done erev Shabbos, is not doiches Shabbos. Now, the Mishnah then tells us one more rule, and that is, according to Moshe Shine, and what this next line means.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
When are we talking about? Are we talking about on Friday morning or in the afternoon?
What do you mean? No, it could be done anytime. The grinding, it could be done anytime. There's no restriction, as long as it's not done on Shabbos. Now, the average mincha, we said yesterday, it had to. You measured it, and the measuring cup was not a klisharis, so the measuring could be done outside of the azara. But says the Mishnah, Kol ha-menachos yesh behen ma'isa kli b'fnim, ve'ein ben ma'isa kli b'chutz. What most mafarshim explain, what this means is, you have to use a klisharis at some point. Meaning, don't think that you could get away with using a chol measuring cup, and then I won't put it into a klisharis. I'll mix it on a board, and I'll make it into dough on the board. No, at some point, you need to use a klisharis. At some point. As we'll see in the Gemara, the same way the average chatas needed a klisharis, a mincha needs a klisharis also. So even if you believe that the measuring cup was not a klisharis, at some point, you got to use a klisharis. You can't just use the top of a pan. You know what I mean? Like you can't use a tabletop. You need a klisharis at some point. Okay. Now the Mishnah says, okay, today's topic is going to be regarding the shtei halechem. You have to focus on this one. It's not very complicated, but the shtei halechem, let me sort of say outside, and then we'll see it inside. Okay. The shtei halechem was placed on the table on two different piles. Now, the shape of the shtei halechem was very unique. Let's go with the opinion that it was a box. So it was an open box. So it had the flat top, had the two sides, and then as we're going to see, there were horns that were pointing at each other, horns facing each other. So it was straight up, like a partially closed box. That's the way the lechem apanim looked. So what was the size of the lechem apanim? So the Mishnah says, first of all, the shtei halechem. The shtei halechem was, which is the two loaves that run Shavuos, orchan shiva tvachim. There were 7 tvachim long, rochban arba tvachim, 4 tvachim wide. The karnoisav arba etzbaisav, and the horns, again, the corners, sort of like they add a little dough to make it look like horns. That was 4 finger breadths in length. Okay, that was the shtei halechem. The lechem apanim was different. Arkan asara tvachim, it was 10 tvachim long. Rochban chamisha tvachim, it was 5 tvachim wide. The karnoisav sheva etzbais, and the horns were 7 finger breadths in length. Now, by the way, 10 tvachim long was unfolded, as we'll see. Meaning it was 10 tvachim long, which is the entire length of the shulchan, but it didn't actually go that way. It was 10 tvachim, and then they folded it so that it was much smaller than that. Okay. The Mishnah says, Rabbi Yehuda says, let me give you a device to remember the difference between the Shtei Lechem and Lechem Aponim. This is the same Rabbi Yehuda who said that Tzach Hadash V'Achav. He was very into devices. So Rabbi Yehuda says, Shaleitite Zadad Yahaz. Zadad is 744, because that's the Shtei Lechem, 7 Tvachim long, 4 Tvachim wide, 4 etzbais on the corners, and the Lechem Aponim was Yahaz, 10 by 5 by 7. Okay. Zak the Mishnah ben Zayma Omer ben Esata ala Shulchan Lechem Panim Lufanai Tamid. Lechem Panim. What does it mean Lechem Panim? It's showbread. Shiyuloi Panim. They have to have surfaces. Meaning, Ben Zayma is explaining why is it called Lechem Aponim. Lechem Aponim because it has a lot of surfaces. Why is it that it was shaped like a box? You ever ask yourself that? Just make a nice big round challah. The answer is it has to have Lechem Panim. It has to have surfaces. A box, an open box, it's got the flat. It's got the sides, it's got the top, it's got a round, it's got a lot of surfaces. That's the lechem aponim. It means the bread of surfaces. Hashulchan, okay. Now let's figure this out for a second. We know that the showbread was 10 by 5. That we know. What we don't know was how big was the shulchan. Now, the Torah tells us, it's important to understand, just focus on this one. The Torah tells us that the shulchan was 2 amas by 1 amma. The question is, how big is that in Tvachim? It's the Machlokes Tanoim. Is an Amma 5 Tvachim or is an Amma 6 Tvachim? Which means it's either 10 by 5 or 12 by 6, depending on how you hold. So Zak the Mishnah, HaShulchan, how big was the Shulchan? Arkuai Sara v'Rachbei Chamesh. It was 10 Tvachim by 5 Tvachim. Lechem Aponim. Okay, so it's 10 by 5. So that's this table. This table is 10 long, 5 wide. Now, you'll say, well, the bread is 10 tvachim long, so just lie them out. But then you only have one pile. So it doesn't work like that. The bread was actually on its thinner side. So what they would do is like this. Think of this table, right? This is the thinner side, not the longer side. They would lay it out 10. Now 10 tvachim, that means you're going to have 5 in the middle. You're going to have 2.5 hanging over here and 2.5 hanging over there. They folded it up. So they folded it up 2.5 tvachim by 2.5 tvachim. Because the table was 10 by 5. You lay the 10 tvachim out lengthwise against the 5 width. So now you have the 5 in the middle, 2.5 on either side. 5 plus 2.5 plus 2.5 is 10. So then what you do is you fold it up. So it was 5 by 2.5 on its side. That's how you got to, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Correct. Bread was malleable, and it was in a specific mold to be soft, and then you folded it. By the way, the implication of this sugya is that it was folded after it was baked, that it was baked sort of flat. Even though we said yesterday there were molds, it seems that the molds didn't really keep the shape. The molds just basically kept it from puffing up. So yeah, it's probably like a thicker lava. So it says the Mishnah, Arka asar v'rachba chamisha, noisin arka kineged rachba el shulchan. You take the 10 tefach bread, you lay it across the 5 width. V'koifel tvachayim umechza mikan. You fold 2.5 on one side, v'tvachayim umechza mikan, and 2.5 on the other side. Nimtza arka mimaloi rachba shel shulchan. So by the way, it turns out, so you'll have 2 sets of 5, 10 tvachim long, 5 plus 5, so the bread filled up the entire table. According to this opinion, there was no room on the table for anything else. Because you had 2 sets of 5 by 5, on a 10 tefach long table. That's it. So it was full. Mamish full. That's why the frankincense spoons were not on the table according to this opinion, because there was no room. It was placed on the bread because there was no room. Huh? And that's why we said yesterday, according to this, those snifim, those boards, were actually on the ground because there was no room to put the boards on the actual table because the bread filled up the entire table. That's this opinion. Now, why does this opinion feel this way? Because we know the bread was 5 tvachim wide. How big was the shulchan? According to this, it was 10 by 5. 5 tvachim wide next to 5 tvachim wide fills up 10. But I also mentioned to you that there's a different shita. The other shita holds that the size of the shulchan was not 10 by 5. It was 2 amas. It was 2 amas by 1 amma. I think so. That's what I would do. The point, no. I wasn't saying go outside. I was saying I would stand up. It's easier for me to stand up. Point is, according to the first opinion, the shulchan was 2 by 1, 2 amas by 1 amma. According to the first opinion, an amma is 5 tefachim, which means it's 2 by 1, it's 10 by 5. There you go. Rav Meir disagrees. He says no, an amma is 6 tefachim, which means it's 12 by 6. So let's figure this out. Let's just do the math outside. It's 6 tefachim wide. I take a 10 tefach bread, I lay it across 6 tefachim. You know what happens? I don't have 2.5 on either side, I have 2 on either side. So according to Rav Meir, the vertical sides of the bread were not 2.5, they were 2 tefachim top. 2 tefachim on either side, not 2.5. And by the way, you know what it also means? Each bread is 5 tefachim. 5 plus 5 is 10. The length of the table is 12, according to Rav Meir. So you actually have 2 tefachim of airspace, empty space in the middle. And he held that the frankincense was placed in the middle. You understand? Mm-hmm. Gavin?
Yes.
Meaning, according to Rav Meir, the length of the table was not 10 by 5, it was 12 by 6. Which means that you take the 6 tefachim, lay out the 10 tefach bread, and instead of getting an overhang on either side of 2.5 to fold up, you get an overhang of 2. So according to Rav Meir, each showbread was a little bit shorter. It wasn't a 2.5 side, it was 2 side. You understand? Zak the Mishnah, Rav Meir says no. I believe that the shulchan was arkay shnei masa rach by shisha. It wasn't 10 by 5, it was 12 by 6. So therefore, you do the same thing. You take the lechem aponim, arkay asar v'rach bechamesh. You have a 10 by 5 lechem aponim. You take the 10 tefachim, lay it out lengthwise against the width. So you got the 6 tefach width, you lay out the 10 tefach bread. What do you have? You got 2 hanging on over side. Now, what you also have is 2 tefach are going to be in the middle. Why? Because it's 10 tefach long. It's 5 tefachim on each bread next to each other. That's 5 plus 5 is 10. But the table was 12 tefachim long, which means, according to Rav Meir, you have 2 tefachim in the middle. What do you do with those 2 tefachim? The purpose of those 2 tefachim is for air. The last thing you want with bread, when bread gets moldy, is when there's no air. When bread is on top of each other, a lot of bread on top of each other, it gets moldy, especially when the bread is hot. So the purpose of the 2 tefachim in the middle is for airflow. That's what Meir says. Abba Shaul, there's 2 tefachim in the middle, according to Meir, because the entire table is 12 tefachim long. 5, that's 10. You're going to have 2 in the middle. The purpose of the 2 is for airflow. Air should flow around so that the bread is not right on top of each other. No, the pictures. You look at the article, that's pictures. Now the Abba Shaul says there's a different shot of why you need 2 tefachim in the middle. It's not for airflow. Abba Shaul oimer shama yenoisim shnei bazika levayne shalachem aponim. That's where you put the frankincense spoons. They were on those 2 tefach insert. Says the Gemara Amulai. They said to Abba Shaul, Harei kvar nema v'nasata al marechas levayne zaka. They said to Abba Shaul, I thought you put the frankincense on the bread. So he says, no, Amr Lahem Harei kvar nema v'olav mata menashe. The word olav, we find by Mata Menashe when it's describing the traveling, they weren't on top of each other, they were next to each other. So Abba Shaul says the word olav, that they put the frankincense olav al halechem, olav could be next to, not on top. So by the way, so I told you, so if you look in the new Art Scroll Chumashim, they changed from the pictures being like the Tanakama of the frankincense on the bread, now it's next to the bread. They've now adopted Abba Shaul's shita. They don't say that, but that's they followed Abba Shaul. Okay. Zak the Gemara weiter, the Mishnah weiter. Now, again, it helps with the pictures, but let me just explain. You have the table, yeah? So you got the bread. Now, in addition to the bread, there were these 2 golden walls that were standing next to the bread to keep them upright. Now, these golden walls also had to connect to each other. You got one on this side, one on the other side. How did they connect? So there was a divot on either side, and there were rods. Think of like shelves that they would put the rods in. Says the Mishnah, Arba snifim shel zahav hayusham. There were 4 golden boards, mifutzalim rashehem, shahayu soimchem behem, that they would keep, that they would support the bread. Shnaim l'seder zeh, b'shnaim l'seder zeh. 2 boards for each pile of bread. 1, 1, so that's 4 boards total. B'chatzi kana chalul. I'm sorry. Esim ushmeina kanim. They had 14, each set of boards had 14 divots and 14 rods that were placed in that divot. On each bread, the bread sat on the 3 rods per loaf. Now, Here's the issue. Apparently, to get the bread in and out, you have to take the rods out. You can't, the rods are too tight. As we'll see, the rods are mamish, really, really tight in the bread. You can't get the breads out unless you pull out the rods. Now, in order to pull out the rods and to put back the rods, now when did they take the bread off and replace the bread? They did it on Shabbos. The problem is taking rods out of a divot and putting it back on Shabbos is a rabbinic form of boina. So, Chazal did not want to do that on Shabbos. So what they did is Erev Shabbos, I'll say it outside, we'll say it inside. Erev Shabbos, the Kohen would take the rods off and put it on the floor. So for one day, the bread was just supported on itself. They would take off the old bread, put the new bread on, no rods. Matzei Shabbos, they would put the rods in. Sagt the Mishnah, Lo yisider kanev lo netilasim deichos Shabbos el nichas ben Shabbos v'shem tov v'nasal erker shel shulchan. Okay, one more halacha, and then we'll start the Gemara. Kol hakelim shayu b'mikdash arkan la'arka shel bayis. The Beis Hamikdash was east to west. Whenever you had an item that was like a rectangle, it would also go lengthwise east to west. Okay, Zak the Gemara. Now we said in the Mishnah one quick halacha before we address some of the things regarding the shulchan. We mentioned that regarding the standard mincha, even though you believe that the kli that was used for measuring was not nimshach with the shemen hamishcha, you have to use one kli shares when you're preparing the bread. So you can't just do everything outside. On a plastic board. You need a kli shares. That's what the Mishnah said. The question is, where do you get this from? Shalos Rabbi Zuminaya, and they asked Rabbi, how do you know that the bread, you needed a kli shares in the process? So Amar Lahem, it says in the pasuk the pasuk in Yechezkel says, "V'yomer Elai," and they said to me, "Zeh hamakom asher yibashu." He's seeing the Beis Hamikdash, and the Malachim say, "Zeh hamakom asher yivashlu shama kahanim." This is the place where the kahanim cooked and prepared as a osham v'sachatos, asher yovu es hamincha, and they'll also bake the mincha. So you see the pasuk equates the mincha with the chatas and the asham. Why does it do that? The answer is just like the chatas and asham, you need a kli shares. So to the mincha, you need a kli shares. So the Gemara says, mincha domi the asham v'chatas, ma asham v'chatas tunen kli, af mincha nami tunen kli. Good. Now, we also said there were two rows of 6 loaves each. How tall were these loaves? So we said it's a machlokes. According to Rameir, the loaves were 2 tvachim high. According to Rabbi Yehuda, they were 2.5 tvachim high. Let's do a little math, very simple math. 6 loaves at 2 tvachim high is 12 tvachim. 6 loaves at 2.5 tvachim high is 15. What's the difference if it's 12 or 15? Who cares? You're saying, well, one's 12, one's 15. I'll tell you the nafkamina. The shulchan was mekadesh all the bread, merely placing it on the shulchan. That means that the shulchan had an airspace of kedusha of either 12 or 15. What's the difference? Let's say I put another carbon in the airspace of 12 or 15, it'll be kadosh. So how high does the shulchan's airspace of kedusha radiate? Well, according to one opinion, 12. According to another opinion, 15. We don't have a raya goes above that. So says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. I don't know, you place, for whatever reason, on the table, you place, you have an extra piece of bread, a leg of an oila that's on your way there. You put it down. I don't know what the nafkamina would be practically, but the point is, how high does the airspace of the kedusha of the shulchan radiate? Either 12 or 15. So says the Gemara, L'divrei ha'omer, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that each bread was 2.5 tvachim tall. So nimtza shulchan mekadesh chamisha aser tvachim amayla. That means that the shulchan had a radii of kedusha of airspace of 50 tvachim tall, because that's how high the bread was. L'divrei ha'omer tvachayim koifel, but according to Rameir, that each bread was only 2 tvachim tall. Nimtza shulchan mekadesh shneim aser tvachim amayla. Good. What you do see from here, and this is going to take us a length till the end of the daf, is that how high was the shulchan? It was 15 tvachim above the table. You have the table, and then how high above the table? 15 tvachim was the most. Why was it the most? Because, and that's the kedusha only goes to 15, because you have 6 loaves. Each loaf was the most 2.5. 2.5 times 6 is 15. Says the Gemara, ha'ikakanim, what about the rods? All these rods, that's got to bump up the height a little bit? The answer is no. Kanim shakua mishkale. The bread was actually sunken over the rods, meaning sort of the bread, like, smushed over the rods, so that the rods added no height, because they sort of were, the bread was sunken over them. Says the Gemara, wait a minute. What's the purpose of the rods? What do you need the rods for? The purpose of the rods is for airflow, to avoid it being moldy. If the bread is sunken over the rods, it'll be weiter moldy. So says the Gemara, wait a minute. My time, what's the purpose of the rods? Mishum mefushe lechem. It's to avoid moldiness, to let air flow. So Saif said, come afish lechem. But if the bread is sunken over the rods, and the bread is not elevated at all, and it's mamish sunken around the rods, like they sort of pushed in the bread to make room for the rods, then there's no purpose of the rods. They're just going to weiter moldy. So the Gemara says, no, demakle porta, you're right. The rods were a little bit above the bread, maybe a millimeter. So it wasn't sunken up, it was enough of a millimeter of airspace. Says the Gemara, oh, wait, a millimeter? So it's not 15 tefachim, it's above 15. And the Gemara is going to answer, yes, it's technically a little bit above 15, but it's not 16 tefachim. So because it's not an official tefach above, therefore it still counts as 15. Says the Gemara, Ika'u porta, kivin do have a tefach, lo yichashivle. Says the Gemara, wait a minute. You're telling me the height of the shulchan, of the bread on top, everything was with 15. What about the frankincense spoons? Says the Gemara, ha'ika bazikin. What about the spoons of frankincense? So why don't they bump up the heights? So the Gemara says, "B'gavei delechem have a yosvi, ubahadi lechem have a kaimi." The answer is they were inside the top loaf. The top loaf was, think of it as like a U. They put the spoons inside, so it did not actually add any height. Says the Gemara, "Ika kranais." What about the horns? You see, we describe the bread. We sort of know what the bread looked like. Artzko has pictures, but we sort of describe the bread. You have the bottom of the bread, you got the sides, and then it says there are horns. Now, the Gemara thinks that the horns are like horns going up. If there are horns going up, then it's taller than 15. And the Gemara says, no, the horns were actually facing inside the bread. Show bread, because the two horns were facing each other. Says the Gemara, Karnois legavi the lechem kayafli. The horns were folded inside the bread, velechem alayu nachle. And each loaf was basically, so it did not add any height, because the horns were like this, facing the bread. Good. Go to the next page. Now, no, they were like that. Think of it like this. Think of a tissue box. These are the horns. They're facing each other. They're not high. The flaps are down. I don't know, but the shulchan is unique because it's mekadesh the bread. Mizbeach is just the fire consumes it. I guess it is, but that goes pashas up to the rakia. I've never heard of any distinction with the mizbeach pashas. It's just anything on the mizbeach you just leave there. Now here's where the Gemara is going to have the final discussion. This is going to take us into the end of the daf. I want to go into Amid Beis because I want to get to the two dots. The Gemara is a kasha. The kasha is ha'ika masgartoi. In addition to the shulchan, there was a thing called the mizgeres. The mizgeres was a one tefach pashtus, a frame. Now the Gemara understands that the frame at this point was on top of the table. Think of it like a shtender. This shtender was the frame, meaning, so the way the Gemara understands the frame was, you had the table, you had an additional tefach frame on top of the table, which you then put the bread on, so the bread is not 15, it's 16. So says the Gemara, no. There's a machlokes tanoim, was the frame above the table or below the table, sort of like a lattice work by the legs. So the Gemara says it was actually below the table, meaning you had the tabletop, and then below the tabletop there was like a framework, so it didn't affect the height at all. Says the Gemara, wait a minute. I'm sorry. The Gemara even then adds, I'll just say it out so we'll see it inside. The Gemara says, let's assume the frame was on top. You don't understand what the frame was. The frame was not this. The frame was a rim, a decorative rim that was attached to the table, like this, which you then put the bread directly on the table. Meaning they thought the frame was a platform on the table. No. The frame was around the table. Even if you believe it was on top, it was around the table. It was a framework on the edge that was welded, that was connected to the table itself. So then it was like a nice little, a lip, like a nice lip. So then you put the bread directly on the table. It didn't affect the height at all. The Gemara says, Ulamanda Omar Maskarta Lamayla Hoisa, Parkude have a mefarkde, Lechem Gave the Shulchan Haviyasi. The bread still sat on the table. This was just not a decorative lip, a practical lip that sort of made the table like a small receptacle. See, if it's on the bottom, it's purely decorative, it serves no function. If it's on top, it's not a platform the bread is on, it's rather a elevated lip that makes the entire table like a receptacle, like a long U, a long wide U. Says the Gemara, Kidatanya, how do I know that that's what it looked like? Rav Yossi Omer. Rav Yossi has a very interesting shita. You know how we talked about previously that there were these boards with the rods? Rav Yossi believes none of that existed. By the way, Taisus is bothered by the fact that the Psukim imply that they existed. Rav Yossi says no such thing. So wait a minute, if there's no such thing, what had the bread not just fall off the table? The answer is that little lip. That one tefach lip kept the entire thing up. Because once the bottom is in, then you just... So says Rav Yossi, Loi hayasham snifin, there was no such thing as snifin. There were no boards, there were no rods, the whole thing never happened. So what kept the bread from falling off the table? That lip, that one tefach lip, that was it. And Amr Loi, and they responded to him, the Tanaim said, that lip was under and it was decorative, so I don't know what you're talking about. So anyway, Bekitzer, Peladik and Rav Yossi, fine. Now, let me say outside what the Gemara is going to do, and then we'll see inside. Okay, quick rules about Tumah Tahara. It's not complicated. A piece of wood, normally, if a piece of wood is just a flat, like a flat cutting board, wood, it's not makabel tumah, because wood needs to have a receptacle. It has to have an inside and an outside. But if it's a flat piece of wood, it's not. The Gemara makes a presumption that if that piece of wood is so big that it's now a tabletop, then it is makabel tumah. Now,
because it's a kli.
Correct. Now, what we also know, that's what we know, number one, and what we also know is that the shulchan in the Mizbeh, in the Beis HaMikdash, was makabel tumah. Now, here's the thing. If you believe that the shulchan, that the mizgeres was below, which means the shulchan was a wooden tabletop that could be removed, and the bottom was just decorative, then basically then the shulchan is a great source for it. The shulchan is a wooden flat top, no receptacle, and it's makabel tumah. So you see that a tabletop that's wood is makabel tumah. But if you believe that the miskeres was on top and it was connected to it, so then the wood, it's not a wooden tabletop, it's not flat. It's actually a long receptacle, therefore no makar. You understand? That the Gemara says. The Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan l'divrei omer miskarta l'mata haisa, if you believe that the frame was below and it was decorative, which means the tabletop was just a not connected piece of wood. Now, by the way, I want to point out for a second, it wasn't really wood, it was covered in gold. It was gold plated, but we'll get to that. Right now, the Gemara is literally describing it as wood, mamish, wood. It's a wooden tabletop that comes off because there was no receptacle because the miskeres was under and it was decorative. Mamish is a wood tabletop, and yet it was makabel tumah. So the Gemara says, Tava mesapechas tameya. You could see from here that a wood tabletop is makabel tumah. But l'divrei omer miskarta l'mayla hoisa. But if you believe that this frame was on top and it was actually a lip, which means the shulchan in the Beis HaMikdash was not a wooden tabletop. It rather looked like this, because it had a frame around it. It had like a lip, which means it wasn't a flat tabletop. It was a receptacle. So the reason why it's makabel tumah is because it's a receptacle. It's not a raya that a flat top would be makabel tumah. Says the Gemara, then tab misabechas tibaylach. We don't have a source. It's still unclear whether a wooden tabletop is makabel tumah. Now, by the way, this is making a presumption that what? That the shulchan in the mizbeach, the shulchan in the Beis HaMikdash was makabel tumah. Here's the question though. Forget about it. Let's say you want to say a wooden tabletop is makabel tumah because it's big and it's a kli, like my father says, a kli. Great. There's another rule about wood. Wood is only makabel tumah if it's moved. When was the shulchan ever moved? I thought the shulchan was stationary 365. And if a wooden item is stationary, it's not makabel tumah. So says the Gemara, you want to say a raya, the wood is makabel tumah if it's a tabletop, and the shulchan was a tabletop because the tavla was under it, and it's makabel tumah. Why is it makabel tumah? You never move the shulchan. No, but in the Beis HaMikdash, it was never moved. So the Gemara says that's not true. They actually would pick it up. It's a famous medrash. They would pick it up by oil regel to show ru'u chibaschem lefnei hamakam, because a big miracle happened that it was fresh for a week long. They would lift up the shulchan 3 times a year to show Klal Yisrael, so it was moved. Correct. So it was moved. Says the Gemara, Michlal de Shulchan bar kabuli tumahu. Your presumption is that the Shulchan of the Beis HaMikdash was makabel tumah. Wait a minute. Kli ei ta'asin lenachasu. Isn't it wood that's never moved? It's a wood vessel that's never moved. V'chol kli ei lenachas in makabel tumah. Even if you want to say that a tabletop is makabel tumah, but it has to be moved at some point. This is never moved. My taima, right? Your tabletop. You don't move that table. It's very heavy. And not makabel tumah. Why? Dumi de sak b'inan. It has to be like a sack. Masak metalto malavarek and avkli metalto american. Wood has to be moved. By the way, metal doesn't. But wood has to be moved. It's based on, not for now, but it's based on, I think it's Halachah Mishmesina. So it says the Gemara, the Shulchan was never moved. So the Gemara says, no, Shulchan Nami Metaltel Malav. The Shulchan was moved at times. Kid Rish Lakish as Rish Lakish as Dam Rish Lakish. Ma'idich Sev Al HaShulchan HaTahar. The Pasuk says that you place it on the Tahar Shulchan, which implies that the Shulchan could become Tameh. It has to make sure it's Tahar, which means it could become Tameh. It says the Gemara, Tahar Mechlal Dikatuma. So wait a minute, but it was never moved. The answer is yes, it was. 3 times a year they would lift up the shulchan, umaran lo'lechem, and to show the lechem for all the Jews that were there. They would say to them, look how beloved you are. Levi. What was the miracle of the lechem upon him? That when they took off the bread, it was as fresh and as hot. So they would show that. So because it was moved, therefore it's mekabel tumah. Now, this is going to take us to the 2 dots. I'll do this in 2-3 minutes. Very simple. We're bringing a raya from the shulchan. The shulchan was mekabel tumah. Yeah? Shulchan was mekabel tumah. But wait a minute. It wasn't moved. Yes, it was. But wait a minute. It's a flat top and it's wood. The answer is, you see from here, a wooden flat top is mekabel tumah. This entire discussion has been making an assumption that the shulchan was wood. It wasn't wood. It was gold-plated. And the halacha is, as we'll see in a moment, that when you have a kli that's plated in another material, when it comes to Tumat Tahara, we go by the plated. I'll give you the source. Now, what if you have a metal utensil, mekabel tumah, but you cover it with marble? Marble is not mekabel tumah. Stone is not mekabel tumah. The halacha is, it's not mekabel tumah anymore. Why? Because you go by the plated. Now, that's to remove tumah, but the point is, you see, you go by the plated. So you bring a raya from the shulchan, that a wooden item, and it has to be moved. You're like constantly thinking the shulchan is wood. It's not wood. It's covered in gold. If it's gold, then it's metal. Then, by the way, metal doesn't need a receptacle. Metal doesn't have to be moved. This entire amid is a moot point. Says the Gemara. The Gemara says, the typically mishum tzipoy. Why are you focusing on the wood utensil? What about the gold plated? And once it's gold plated, it should have the status of metal, not wood. How do I know that you go by the plating and you don't go by the inner? The Gemara says, Miloi Tanan, doesn't it say in the Mishnah, Hashulchan valdoviki shenifchasu shehipron beshayish. You have a wooden table, yeah, so it's mekabel tumah, but you cover it with marble. So the halacha is, v'shayir b'hem makam anachas kaisis. Is it marble and not mekabel tumah, or is it wood? So the halacha is like this: if you cover it entirely, it's not mekabel tumah. But if you leave over a little space on the table that still has wood enough to put cups on, then it's still a wood table because it's not entirely covered. And I cover with marble. Marble plated. So the halacha is, if it's entirely marble plated, it's not mekabel tumah anymore because the stone's not mekabel tumah. But if you leave a space in the middle to use that still has wood that you put your plates on, then it's still a wood table. What do you see from here? You see that you go by the plating. You don't go by the inner.
I understand.
Yeah.
It's not plating because.
Well, what do you mean it's not plated? It is plated. It is plated.
You take gold.
No,
Gold
yeah.
is plated.
Okay.
It's connected.
Okay.
Marble is not.
They plated it with marble. I'm not a marble plater. They did it. That's what they did. They plated it with marble. They covered it with marble. I don't know. It was a Metzias. Says the Gemara, Tmeyin Rabbi Yehuda Omer Malkam Hanochas Chatichas. Or Rabbi Yehuda says it's not enough to leave a place for cups. You have to actually leave a place for meat also. I mean, it has to have the original functionality. But Kitzer, they're talking about how much has to be left unplated to still have to retain the status of wood. But what do you see from here? Shari loy, shari loy. If you covered it entirely in stone, you think of stone plated because you think of thin. They took a piece of stone, and covered the wood. Okay, whatever. It's a thicker stone. So it's a slab of stone on top of the wood. The point is, if it's covered in the other material, you go by the outer material. So why over here are you constantly hacking with the shulchan that it's wood? It's not wood, it's gold plated. Because you see from the stone that you go by the plating. So very quickly, we'll run through this very quickly. The Gemara says, maybe there's a difference between whether the plated is hammered in with nails or not. Meaning, maybe you only consider, you go by the plating if it's hammered in with nails. But if it's gold plated, not hammered in, as in the case of the Beis Hamikdash, there's no nails, maybe you don't go by the plating. Maybe there's a difference between using nails or not. The problem is it's not true. The Gemara says, Haboy minei Rish Lakish Rav Yochanan. Rav Yochanan, and Rish Lakish asked this shaila to Rav Yochanan. He asked the following: B'tzipoy oimid or b'tzisha ein oimid? Does it matter whether the gold plating or the plating material is anchored in with nails or not? He also asked, B'shchifa as levizvizin or shaloichi vizvizin? What if you don't cover the rim? So you cover the tabletop in a plating regarding Tumat Tahara, but you don't cover the rim. So Amar Le, Rav Yochanan responded, Lo yishna tzipa oimid, lo yishna tzipa sheina. I don't care whether it's anchored, I don't care whether it's not anchored. Lo yishna chipas levizvizin, lo yishna chipa lo chivizvizin. Either way, you go by the plating. So back to the original kasha. Why are you hacking with the shulchan that it's wood? It's gold plated, which means it's gold. So the Gemara says, V'chite ma'atzei shitim chashiv lo batli. Maybe it's different. Maybe you normally go by the plating when the inside material is cheap. This is atzei shitim wood. Atzei shitim wood is very, very expensive. It's very, very chashiv. Maybe with atzei shitim wood, then it's more chashiv than the gold. The problem is, hanicha l'rish lakish de'amar loishna ela b'kli akligus. Haboy medina sayam avakli mesmas chashivi v'lei batli ela Rav Yochanan de'amar kli mesmas nami batli Michael Memar. The problem is that's Rish Lakish shita, but that's not Rav Yochanan. Rish Lakish says you only go by the plating when the inside material is cheap. Rav Yochanan says, but if the inside material is very chashiv, then you don't. Then the plating is not the ikr. The ikr is the inside, but it's not Rav Yochanan shita. Rav Yochanan shita is you always go by the plating, even if the inside is more chashiv. So over here you have the shulchan; it's gold plated. Rav Yochanan doesn't care about anchors; he always goes by the plating. The atzei shitim wood is so chashiv. Maybe it's even more chashiv than gold. The answer is Rav Yochanan doesn't care about that. He doesn't care about the chashivas. He just cares on what's the outside. So why is the shulchan being compared to a wooden utensil when it's covered in gold? And the Gemara concludes, Shani shulchan. I'll tell you why the shulchan is different. De rachmana karye eitz, because the Torah calls the shulchan wood. So because the Torah calls it wood, that's the Torah saying this is the exception. Normally you go by the plating, but the Torah calls it wood. Even though it's gold plated, you see the Torah is saying it has the status of wood. As we'll see, Shenemar, as we end with this, HaMizbeach, the Mizbeach. Now we're talking about the Shulchan, but Mizbeach, the Gemara understands the Mizbeach is really the Shulchan. Eitz, Shalish Amis Gavoya, V'Arka Shtei Amis, Umiktsayis Loi, V'Arka V'Karsa of Eitz, V'Dabrei Zeh HaShulchan. So it's talking about the Shulchan the whole time, because there's the mentions of the Shulchan, and it says Zeh HaShulchan. And you see the Shulchan is called Eitz. Oh, so even though it's gold-plated, a Torah calls it wood, so it has the status of wood when it comes to Tumah Tahara, and therefore, if you believe that the Miskaris was under it, it was a tabletop, it was Mekabel Tumah, because it was moved 3 times a year, good. Now, just to end off the discussion, as Agav, this Pasuk calls the Shulchan, it's describing the Shulchan, but it calls it a Mizbeach. Why is the Shulchan called a Mizbeach? Says the Gemara, Pasuk Mizbeach v'sayim Shulchan, the famous Gemara, Rav Yechon B'Elazar T'Avadayu, Bizman she'Beis HaMikdash Kayim Mizbeach mechaper al'adam. Achsh she'ein Beis HaMikdash Kayim Shulchan shel adam mechaper alav. The Gemara just says a raya. It's a completely drasha. It's not halachic based. It's talking about the Shulchan. But why is the Shulchan called a Mizbeach? Because in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, when you did an Avera, you brought a carbon on the Mizbeach. We don't have a Mizbeach anymore. So you know what's mechaper you? The Shulchan, which means if you have guests, and you have aniyim at your table, that brings the kapara. I will stop here.